Well, good afternoon. I just want to say thank you to Pastor Greg and to everybody else who has put together this conference. And I am humbled to be invited to speak and share some of my thoughts on race and culture. I started my podcast called Informed Dissent a couple of years ago. It was in response to what I was seeing just basically in culture and politics and what we were seeing all around us in the media. And it was just a way of putting out resistance against the prevailing socio-political narratives that we were being bombarded with and the challenging the lies that we were being told. And the tagline of my podcast is actually challenge the narrative. And that's how I basically embodied my political persona and how I approach socio-political issues. So when we're told something in the media, we're told something in politics, the first thing I want to do, and it's a little contrarian, but the first thing I want to do is say, okay, is that true? Is it true? Are we being told the whole truth? What are we not being told? And where is the truth actually lying? And that's really where my podcast has lied and where my political persona has lied. And we know as Christians that that is exactly what we're called to do. We're called to challenge the narrative of the world. We're called to share the truth, the word of God, and dispel the lies of the devil. And we're called to shed light on the darkness in love, of course. But we speak the truth in love, and that isn't always easy to do. That isn't always easy to do, especially these days. But my hope and prayer for the time that I have with you today is that God uses me to provide you with the ammunition that you need to help dispel the darkness surrounding the issues of race in our country, and to go to battle against the pernicious poison of the ideas like critical race theory, anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, whatever they might attach to these ideas, whatever label they attach to them. Ultimately is a divisive sickness that is permeating our country. Critical race theory. So what is it? Most people have heard of it by this point. And with all the controversy surrounding public schools and public education, whether or not it's being taught. But an actual definition seems to be elusive, even among those who claim to support it. And this definitional haziness is used as a tool to manipulate people, to say, well, you don't actually know what critical race theory is. So when you complain about race-centric curriculums, or you complain about something going on at your business, race-centric training sessions, or even policy in government that's centered on race, when you complain about those things, people will tell you what? Oh, that's not critical race theory. You don't even know what critical race theory is, and they'll use it to dismiss your argument, so in order to quell you, in order to shut you down, so that you can't say anything about it and you can't push back against it. That's not CRT. So what is it then? Well, according to one of the founders of CRT, Richard Delgado, the critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues as the conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, setting, group and self-interest, and emotions and the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. This is directly from the source. This is what they say critical race theory is. Critical Race Theory and Introduction is the name of that book where I drew that definition from. And I want you to pay attention to a few things in that definition. It considers the same issues as conventional civil rights, but places them in a broader perspective, including economics, history, setting, group and self-interest, emotions, and the unconscious. The unconscious. That's an important aspect that we'll talk about in a second. Another key piece is that they reject incrementalism and step-by-step progress. So then what is the opposite of incrementalism and step-by-step progress? Revolution. If it's not incremental, if it's not step-by-step, it's a revolution. And that's what they're calling for. They're calling outright for revolution. And the last thing is that they question the foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law. Liberal in the sense means the true meaning, that is freedom, individual rights, consent of the governed, equality before the law, etc. And critical race theory is antagonistic toward these things. Now, I mentioned the unconscious, and what needs to be understood is that critical race theory, at its very foundation, relies on this idea that racism is enveloped in our institutions and that it often operates unconsciously without even the knowledge of those engaging in it. It's like magic, like a white supremacist boogeyman. This is what they believe. I know we laugh about it, but this is actually what they believe. If I were to summarize critical race theory, I would say that it is an ideology embraced by race activists that operates from the foundational assumption that racism is endemic in our country, that it is deeply ingrained in all of our institutions, that it is intertwined into the very fabric of our society, that concepts such as equality, neutral principles of the law, and liberalism, that is individual rights, liberty, consent of the governed, etc., are its natural enemies, and that it must be rectified, not through incrementalism, but through revolution. That is critical race theory at its root. So when people ask you what critical race theory is, that's what it is. The belief that racism is so pervasive that it has embedded itself into the normal everyday operations of our society, of each and every one of our lives, to the point of invisibility, that we can't even see it. It's just the natural way that we interact with each other. Racial disparities, viewed through the lens of CRT, are automatically attributed to racism, even if no overtly racist acts are apparent. White people are said to benefit from a system of white supremacy, whether they know it or not. Non-white people, likewise, are oppressed by the same system, whether they know it or not. In this view, the fundamental operation of the system itself automatically perpetuates racism and disparate outcomes among racial groups. It is such a pathological way of viewing the world, such a pathological way of looking at each and every one of our lives. It completely removes the agency of the individual and claims that outcomes are wholly dependent on invisible systems, systems that were apparently built to perpetually sustain white supremacy, even if no actual white supremacists operate within it. It's insidious. Ibram X. Kendi. Some of you have probably heard of this guy. He's the face of the anti-racism movement. He's a professor at Boston University, and he has stated explicitly that racial disparities in a given system are, in and of themselves, evidence of racism. He has also said that the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination. So it's open and blatant racism being promoted by this anti-racism. Ironic. So what this means is they believe that the tables must be turned and that white people must now become and remain the victims of discrimination in order to make up for past discrimination against Black people. They believe this is justice. Open racism. And even if you set that aside, the idea that disparities cannot possibly exist between two groups without the presence of bias is asinine. If it is foolish to expect equal outcomes between two individuals, and it is, then it is foolish to expect equal outcomes between groups of individuals. To quote Dr. Thomas Sowell, a man isn't even equal to himself on different days. Critical race theory also rejects the idea of colorblindness and treating everyone equally, regardless of their race. It dismisses the oft-referenced line of Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, where he said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." CRT advocates believe that such a view is oppressive. They believe that if everyone were treated the same and if race were essentially ignored, then the system of white supremacy would run unchecked, allocating privilege and status to white people while grinding non-white people into the ground under its heel. They believe that race must be placed at the forefront of identity, at the forefront of relationships, and at the forefront of policy making in order to manipulate outcomes. CRT advocates also do not believe in equal opportunity, only in equal results. And you may have heard this term, equity. That's what it means. Equity means equal outcomes. And that's why they spend so much time trying to capture our institutions and infuse their ideology, because they believe if they can control the levers of power, they can control the outcomes and therefore make everyone equal. They are antagonistic toward any concept of equal treatment, even the idea of rights themselves. And that sounds like I'm making it up. I'm not. They are antagonistic toward the idea of rights. And they say that explicitly because they believe, again, that these things only benefit white people while oppressing non-white people. They believe concepts like free speech are mechanisms of marginalization, that speech is only free for white people who use their speech to advance their own power and further marginalize minority groups. They maintain that dismissing the idea of positive rights, that is, the right to something, such as housing or food, in favor of negative rights, that is, the right to be free from something, such as coercion, is nothing more than yet another form of oppression and a product of a white-dominated culture. They believe in standpoint epistemology, which is the idea that racial minorities have significantly more authority to understand and speak on supposed racial oppression due to their position as the quote-unquote oppressed, while others, white people, do not. They reject the concept of objectivity and embrace the pseudo-reality of lived experience and my truth over empirical evidence and the truth. They believe in sacrificing true equality in favor of equal outcomes, and they believe that they can and should take from the haves according to their perceived privilege and give to the have-nots according to their perceived marginalization. Does that sound familiar? Marxism. It's Marxism. It's repackaged Marxism with race replacing class. And this is the game that's being played with critical race theory. They believe that the entire structure of our society is corrupted with racism and racial oppression. And not only is that oppression invisible, but it can only be recognized, understood, and explained by non-white people who adhere to CRT ideology and who apparently have special white supremacy decoder rings because nobody else can see it. Everyone else is oblivious. We're unable to comprehend the experiences of those who suffer under the horrific hand of white supremacy. Vadi Basham calls this ethnic Gnosticism, where the concepts of race and racism are treated as if racial minorities, specifically black people, live some sort of mystical, esoteric existence that cannot possibly be grasped by anyone with another skin color. It is very much a religion. So what has been the result of this? In public schools, we see advanced placement classes and standardized testing discontinued because of disproportionate impact. Not enough black students or brown students getting into advanced classes. So instead of working to get more students up to that level, we get rid of the class itself. This is the way it goes. Grading systems are altered and abolished. Grammar requirements are loosened. White children are taught to deconstruct their whiteness and recognize their privilege, while non-white students are taught that they are inherently victims of a hateful and bigoted system. Now, you hear them claim that critical race theory is not being taught in public schools, and it's only being taught in law schools or whatever else they come up with, right? And how many people have heard that lie? It's only in law schools. That drives me crazy. Because the founders themselves will admit that it has expanded to all other academic professions, including, drumroll, education. They say this explicitly. And what they do is they train their teachers in critical race theory. So when they tell you that they're not teaching it in classrooms, it's a sleight of hand. Technically, they're correct. Technically, they're not teaching it. They're not giving them critical race theory materials to take home and study. What they're actually doing in schools is they're implementing it. Now, one other thing that the founders say explicitly is that critical race theory has two components. It has an academic component and it has an activist component. Academic and an activist component. So the academic portion is the part they're talking about. They're saying, oh, it's only taught in law schools. That's the academic portion. And they're right about that. It's the activism. Activism. That is not a word. Activism. It's the activism part that we see in schools. It's being implemented. It's not critical race theory as much as it is critical race praxis. In corporate settings, white employees are forced to undergo racial sensitivity training and listen to lectures from so-called diversity consultants on how racist they are and how they must be less white. Oh, you know what? I forgot to mention something about the school things. I want to go back just for a second. Last month, the African American Policy Forum held a Zoom event called CRT Summer School, in which panelists discussed topics such as everyday CRT in K through 12, how to teach about race, organizing and teaching against white narratives in social studies textbooks, and CRT education and legislative action. That it's not in schools, right? They decried anti-CRT arguments as right-wing disinformation campaigns while openly claiming to teach educators how to take proactive collective action to expand anti-racist teaching and learning, building our capacity to engage in collaborative, sustaining work that puts our principles into practice. They are training teachers how to implement CRT in their classrooms. They are explicit about it, and they only deflect whenever it's an antagonistic person coming and saying, whoa, I don't want that taught in my classroom. But when they're doing these kind of campaigns, when they have like-minded people in the classroom and they're training, then they're open about it. They admit it openly. We're going to do CRT in schools. So don't ever let anybody tell you that it's not in schools. It absolutely is. In Hollywood, there are demands for non-white actors to be cast regardless of whether they're a good fit for the role, and that they win more awards whether they deserve them or not. All while propaganda is continually infused into films and TV shows that promote the notion of rampant racism against minorities, as well as the desirability and virtue of white guilt. Professional sports leagues are receiving demands for more black coaches while ignoring the disproportionate number of black players. People like Colin Kaepernick claim that NFL players who make, sorry, this makes me laugh. NFL players who make millions of dollars to play a game are the equivalent of slaves in a slave auction. Who else wants to be a slave? Oh, man. We see nonsensical victimhood messaging on helmets and sidelines about how significant a problem racism is in America, and athletes kneeling during the national anthem in some contrived sense of solidarity with the black people who have such a horrible existence in the United States of America. It's so terrible to be black for these people. It sees BLM riots destroy the country, cause billions of dollars in damage, and take the lives of 30+ people, only to be called mostly peaceful by the mainstream media and by politicians. And no white person is ever allowed to protest any of it because they, in their whiteness, cannot possibly comprehend the horrific experience of living as a black person in this irredeemably, systemically racist United States of America. That is critical race theory. The belief that racism is everywhere at all times, regardless of evidence, that non-white people must be given special attention and accommodations to overcome it, not that only non-white people with the correct political views are in a position to define it, that colorblindness and treating everyone equally only perpetuates it, and that our institutions must be reformed or ultimately destroyed because of it. It is racist pseudoscience. It is radicalized activism. It is a vehicle for racial division and segregation. It is a tool for emotional manipulation. It is an ideology of narcissism and ingratitude. It is evil parading as virtue, darkness parading as light. It is the very monster that it claims to be fighting against. It is the antithesis of a colorblind post-racial society or any semblance of what is required to move toward one, which we should be trying to do. It is not an academic discipline. It is a worldview. It is a belief system. It is an extremist religion, It is a racialized distortion filter through which one views reality and truth and comes away with blatant lies. It is a commandment to spread the gospel of racial grievance and victimhood. It is racism pretending to eradicate racism. Now you know what it is, if you didn't already. My wife and I pulled our children out of public schools around the time the COVID lockdowns were happening and decided to take full control of their education. And thankfully, we live in a relatively conservative area, Southern Ohio. And the madness of progressive ideology was not quite on the level of a school like New York City or Portland or something like that. But we should recognize that not even conservative areas are safe from the creep of this ideology. Diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that are commonplace in schools and in hiring practices. Middle school students announcing that they're pansexual. Young girls announcing that they're boys. There's no escaping it except through homeschooling or private school. And we have been intent on raising our children largely outside of a racial framework. And homeschooling has helped us do that. And my children currently have no racial identity. And we would like to keep it that way for as long as possible. And people often ask me how we handle racial issues in our house. And the simple answer is that we don't use racial identity at all. Nor do we want to treat skin color as being central to who we are. My kids are completely removed from that. They recognize differences between themselves and other kids, of course, but the importance they place on those differences is negligible. For instance, my oldest son is dark-skinned with black hair, and while my younger son has much lighter skin and blonde hair. My two daughters both have lighter brown skin, close to my wife's, and light brown hair. And we used to joke that if you lined them all up by age, it looked like a printer was running out of ink. You can't laugh at that, that's racist. Oh man, one of my daughters even has blue eyes, while the other eyes are brown. The other's eyes are brown. And these differences are not ignored. They see the differences. They are well aware of the differences, but they see them as inconsequential. They see them as unique to the individual person, and it has no effect on how they treat each other. There's no scale of brotherhood or sisterhood based on skin, hair, or eye color. And it's the same with their friends, most of whom are white. It's the same with their entire family on their mom's side, nearly all of whom are white. And it just isn't a topic of discussion or something that we dwell on. They don't spend their days thinking about it or filtering all their experiences through it. It quite literally does not matter. They see these people as their family and as their friends, and that's it. There's nothing more to it. They are unique individuals, and they see others as unique individuals. And we don't put much weight on ancestral heritage either. My wife's ancestry is mixed. Her mother would be considered white, and her father would be considered black. But each of them have their own heavily mixed ancestries. My own ancestry is also mixed, including a hodgepodge of people from various countries and cultures. And as a result, my children have family members who span the entire spectrum of melanin variation. And it seems foolish to teach them that they should be attached to some family members, but not to others based on race, right? Or that they share an ancestral bond with some family members, but not others. It would be asinine to teach them that they're black and therefore victims, or to teach them that they're white and therefore oppressors. It would be foolish to teach them that they must cling to either identity or feel some kind of kinship with strangers who share it. Or worse, that they should harbor hostility and suspicion toward those who do not. And yet, this is what critical race theory demands of us. It demands that we see the world in this dichotomy of victim and oppressors, and that we place ourselves in one category or the other. I refuse. We teach our children to view people as people, not as members of racial groups. We've discussed how other people view skin color, and race is very important, and that those other people will attempt to get everyone else to see them that way. But we teach them to reject such a distorted way of viewing the world. Recently, I was in Athens, Ohio, where Ohio University is housed, with my 11-year-old son, and we saw some Black Lives Matter graffiti on some of the buildings and on the sidewalk. He asked me what it meant. We talked about the fallacy of race, the Black Lives Matter movement, and how there are people who feel skin color is the most important thing about who they are, and believe people with darker skin are constantly treated badly in America, even though that's not true. He just shrugged his shoulders and said, "That's dumb." I agree, son. Now, that isn't to say that we pretend that racism doesn't exist. That's often a criticism that I get. How can you say racism doesn't exist? Of course it does. Of course it does. We don't pretend that it doesn't. When my kids were still in public school, a little girl who liked my son suddenly decided to stop talking to him. My wife and I didn't think much of it at the time because they're in elementary school. We have boyfriends and girlfriends. You kidding me? But we later discovered that the reason she broke up with him was because her grandfather had told her that white people should be with white people and black people should be with black people. Oof. Now, as parents, we could have taken this opportunity to embrace victimhood and infuse our son with victim mentality. We totally could have done that. We could have turned him against white people by painting them with a broad brush and making it out to seem like this grandfather's terrible attitude was the norm instead of the exception. We could have encouraged him to make that unfair experience central to his identity and taught him to harbor resentment, not only against this particular girl and her family, but against white people and society as a whole. Instead, we explained that this individual is ignorant and that there are indeed people in this world of all skin colors who foolishly believe that skin color matters. We made it clear that such a view is not only wrong, but it is extremely toxic, and that while some people will choose to live their lives in such a miserable fashion, we refuse to participate in that misery. And that's the way we view the world. That's the way we as Christians should view the world. And consider for a moment the arbitrary nature of racial classification by itself. I'm considered to be a part of the black race, but no one else in the world has my exact ancestry and the phenotypical expression of it. No one. My genetic makeup is unique to me. My physical features are unique to me. Even my two brothers are distinct from me, and we have many obvious differences. So if we are to define race by genetics, ancestral heritage, and physical traits, then I can be considered a race in and of myself. And if we dampen the resolution a bit, allowing for more variability in ancestry and physicality, then we can expand the scope to include my children, who share many similarities with both me and my wife. Therefore, my wife, our kids, and I could feasibly be considered a race. So from now on, you will refer to us as the Johnson race. Thank you. But in fact, this sort of familial perspective used to be the meaning of the word race. It referred strictly to family lines, not skin colors. Merriam-Webster lists this as one of the definitions for race. The descendants of a common ancestor, a group sharing a common lineage. In A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, Dr. Alexandre Manette reveals how he discovered that the Marquis Saint Evremond and his brother had raped and murdered a young woman, her husband and her brother. They then had Dr. Manette locked away in the Bastille for 18 years after he tried to expose what they had done. And while in prison, Dr. Manette wrote a letter denouncing the Evremond family, stating that they and their descendants to the last of their race will pay the price. To the last of their race. He was not talking about physical features or ethnicity. He was talking about that specific family. The Evremonds were a race. So by this definition, my kids should be considered part of the Johnson race. Why not? If common ancestry is to be the metric, why shouldn't racial classification be restricted to families? But even then, we must ask, how far back should we go? Which common ancestor do we choose? Should we base our choice on the line from our maternal or paternal grandparents? Everyone has 8 great-grandparents and 16 great-great-grandparents. And this number continues to expand exponentially as you travel backward through the family tree. How far should we travel? Which of these innumerable lines do we follow? What level of commonality qualifies? How common do our ancestries have to be to consider ourselves the members of the same race? Is only one common ancestor sufficient? And wouldn't such a metric actually disqualify the idea of black as being a race or white being a race, since ancestors come from different countries and cultures without any real shared ancestry? Same thing when white people and European ancestors is simply having ancestors from the continent of Africa enough? If so, should South Africans like Elon Musk and Charlize Theron be included? Aren't they African American? Technically. Who qualifies? I have ancestors who are German. Am I white? If we don't rely on family lines, common ancestry, or geography, then should we rely on skin tones? Only people with dark skin can be considered black. Okay, well, what about lower caste Indian people who often have darker skin? Are they black? What about those of African ancestry who have pale skin? Are they white? So the criteria of race is wholly arbitrary. And it is worth noting that critical race theory, bizarrely contradicting itself, does acknowledge this. It does claim that race is indeed a social construct rather than a biological reality. But it does this while simultaneously treating race as objective, biological, and permanent, while also clinging to relativism and claiming objectivity does not exist. So ideological consistency is not a strong point there. But they treat it as permanent and biological, and they assign meaning and moral value to it, while saying that it's a social construct. If its advocates truly believe that race is a contrived social construct and the goal is truly to dismantle racism, then one would think such an endeavor would include an objective to dismantle race itself, right? There should be a movement to eliminate racial collectivism and to embrace individualism. Yet, instead, we see the opposite behavior. So the problem should be clear. The racial categorization CRT advocates use and they've always been nonsensical and unnecessarily divisive, as well as the direct source of racial hostility. Often proponents rebut this by saying black refers to culture, not race. Well, this is false, but it helps highlight the problem we're addressing here. Certainly there are subcultures where some so-called black people subscribe to, in which they participate. But if categorization were truly only about culture, then there would be no need to cling to race at all. However, when I suggest this, I'm met with anger and I'm called names. Uncle Tom, that's my favorite. Race traitor. Surely, if it were only about culture and not race, then suggesting that we let go of race altogether would not be met with such hostility. If race were not important, white people who embrace such cultures could be called black. Why not? It's not unlike people who embrace emo or gaming cultures. There's no racial gatekeeping in those subcultures. If white people can be emo or gamers by embracing those subcultures, why can't they be called black by embracing so-called black culture? The response would be that, well, white people don't have the correct ancestry. Ancestry. The line of argument gives the game away. It is about race and not culture. And these aren't cultures that came from different countries like the Italian or Irish cultures, neither of which depend on skin color. The distinction can only be racial. So again, we end up with a categorization issue. Who can be considered black? What is the correct ancestry? Must you have slaves in your family tree? If so, how many? What if you descend from slave owners? What if you descend from black slave owners? Ooh, they don't like that question. Yeah, about 6,000 black slave owners according to the 1850 census, but we don't talk about that. But who qualifies? How pure does your blood have to be? Shall we return to the one-drop rule, which classifies people as Negro if they had a single African ancestor? And if so, that means all of us in this room can be considered black. But here's something interesting to consider. The differences in amount of melanin in one's skin, which determines the darkness or lightness of skin color, is nothing more than a genetic adaptation based on the geographical location of a particular group of people. And if we go back far enough in human history, we see that we all come from common ancestors who had darker skin, and that includes white people. These ancient human beings from the time of Adam and Eve originated in Africa and the Middle East. And when some of these groups of humans migrated to milder climates with less sunlight and thus less exposure to ultraviolet light, important for synthesis of vitamin D, paler skin became more advantageous for absorbing the UV light that was available. It was merely a matter of natural selection based on location and climate. They did not magically change into a different kind of human being. They didn't suddenly become a different race. They were still the same humans. They merely developed an adaptation to their environment. Genetically, every human being on Earth is around 99.5% identical. Additionally, there's often more genetic variability between two people of the same supposed race than between two people of different races. So race as a biological concept just simply does not exist. So my children are not some group collective, as much as critical race theory wants them to be. I refuse to raise them that way or allow the world to influence them to view life that way. They each have their own individual personalities and interests, wholly divorced from any of their physical traits. They are unique human beings, and that is what we emphasize in our household. While there will always be others in the world who care deeply about these things, like skin color and racial identity, our family does not. Our children's identity does not come from racial categorization or immutable characteristics. Their identity comes from Christ. Now, I'd like to spend the remaining part of my time here just talking about the concepts of gratitude and perspective. Because the obsession with race and racism in our country, the entire ideology of critical race theory is driven by a profound lack of gratitude and perspective. Imagine for a moment a man crawling through the desert. He's exhausted and dehydrated, dragging himself along and doing everything he can to cling to life. Miraculously, just when he thinks he can't possibly go on any further, he comes upon an oasis. He plunges his face in the water and drinks deeply, thinking that this water is the greatest, most precious thing in the entire world. That water would be sacred to him. Now, imagine someone who lives on an island in the middle of a lake, who has running water in his house and even special water filters. It is nearly certain that water would not have anywhere near to the same value that person as it does the man in the desert. In fact, he might even grow to be sick of water, completely taking it for granted. When we are surrounded by abundance, we can easily lose our sense of gratitude and perspective. In those situations, we must be intentional about reminding ourselves just how blessed we really are. When people are dealing with stress and dissatisfaction, some therapists and counselors will have them keep a gratitude journal, detailing all the things that they're thankful for. This practice keeps them centered and their lives in perspective. Marriages often collapse because couples forget why they fell in love and they begin to take each other for granted, many even stepping out on their spouse with another person. They completely lose their sense of gratitude and perspective. People struggle with keeping up with the Joneses, try to cling to celebrity trends, get addicted to plastic surgery to make themselves look more attractive, portray themselves as something they're not on social media, or all of the above because they forget to be grateful. Americans are constantly struggling to get whatever they don't have, while simultaneously taking precious little time to appreciate the things that they do. Actor Jim Carrey once said, "I wish people could realize all their dreams in wealth and fame so that they could see that it's not where you're going to find your sense of completion." We search for meaning as human beings. If we feel that we lack purpose, we will instinctively seek it out somewhere. Some people think meaning is found in how much money they have. Some think it's found in their possessions. Some think it's found in status and popularity. Some think it's found in attractiveness and beauty. Some think it's found in sex. Some think it's found in power. As Christians, we still struggle with these things like any valuable person. But we know that true meaning and purpose can only be found in Christ. There is a God-sized hole in each of us that we are desperately trying to fill with all of these other things, never finding fulfillment and peace, because no matter how hard we try, we just can't fill it on our own. The founders of CRT and those who adhere to it are desperately searching for meaning and purpose. That's what makes critical race theory so attractive. It's a substitute for religious belief. It is an attempt to fill that God-sized hole, whether that takes the form of power, status, money, or establishing one's place in the world, whatever the motivations. Race activists romanticize the past, and they view themselves as reincarnations of historical heroes. They engage in a sort of live-action role play, rejecting reality in favor of some fantasy where they play the part of the oppressed, heroically running into battle against the evil oppressor, like the person who lives in the middle of the lake with running water and fancy filtration systems. All the blessings that we have in this country are completely invisible and taken for granted. They cannot be acknowledged because that would undercut their claims of oppression. Once their immense blessings are recognized, it is difficult for others to take the tragic character that they play seriously. It's like a wealthy celebrity who claims to be oppressed because the temperature of his Olympic-sized indoor pool is a few degrees too cold. The pool temperature might truly be a problem. It might really be a problem that needs to be addressed. But to ignore all the things that you have and pretend that the problem somehow makes you a victim, it's ridiculous. And that is even if the problem is even real. The foolishness is especially true if the problem is imaginary. A sense of gratitude is vital for staying grounded, even in the face of true hardships. I think a lot about the biblical story of Joseph. His own siblings hated him so much that they threw him in a pit and they sold him into slavery. Can there be anything worse than that? Your own brothers selling you into slavery. And if that wasn't enough, he was later thrown into prison after his master's wife lied and accused him of trying to rape her, even though she was the one who tried to seduce him. He was left in prison for years, and eventually he met Pharaoh's former cupbearer and former baker there. He interpreted dreams for each of them, telling the cupbearer he would be restored to his position and the baker that he would be hanged, and both of those things came to pass. The cupbearer promised to tell Pharaoh about Joseph when he was released from prison, but he forgot. And leaving Joseph in prison, alone again. Until one day, a few years later, when Pharaoh couldn't find anyone capable of interpreting his disturbing dreams, and Joseph was released. And his interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, which warned of a coming famine, and wise advice about how to prepare for and survive it, impressed Pharaoh so deeply that he gave Joseph command of all of Egypt, second only to himself. And Joseph was tasked with making sure enough food was stored up so that people would not go hungry during the famine. And eventually, Joseph's brothers, who had sold him into slavery, came to Egypt to buy grain. And Joseph tested them to see if they had truly changed. And the family ultimately reunited and reconciled. Now, I recount that story to make this point. Joseph did not harbor resentment toward his brothers, nor did he demand restitution for what they had done to him. He was grateful to have his family back and for the good that God had brought out of this situation. He said in Genesis 45, verse 5 through 7, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance." What Joseph went through was awful. It was awful, unjust. It was evil. He was truly victimized. There's no denying that. But if none of that had happened, if he had not gone through that experience, he would not have been put into a position to warn of the impending famine, and he never would have been able to help Egypt prepare for it. Many Egyptians would have died. His own family would have died. There has to be gratitude for that. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not saying that what happened to Joseph was good in itself, or that evil things happening to people is good in itself. I'm not saying that it should be celebrated or that bad things in general should be praised. But one thing we often discuss as Christians is God's ability to bring good out of bad situations. That doesn't justify or rationalize the bad, but it does say that these things do not have to lead to bad outcomes. For example, a child conceived in rape can be a blessing to a family, and she can grow up to do amazing things, despite the horrific circumstances that brought her into existence. That was the case for Lane Beachley. She was conceived in rape, and she was given up for adoption rather than aborted. She grew up to be a world champion surfer, has been inducted into both the Australian and American Surfing Halls of Fame, and has launched a foundation that provides scholarships and mentoring for young women in Australia. This was also the case for my own sister-in-law, Tiffany Johnson, who was attacked by a shark while she and my brother were snorkeling in the Bahamas. As a result, she lost part of her arm. This was clearly a devastating and traumatic event for her. But because of this, she has been invited to go on major television shows. She has traveled the country to tell her story. She has launched a full-time ministry about the goodness of God that is blessing, impacting, and inspiring millions of people, all because she was attacked by that shark. Sometimes going through difficult times gives us the wisdom to be able to help others. And this can be tough to consider because it does seem like being grateful for rape or being grateful for shark attacks or whatever other awful thing might happen to a person. But it is actually about having gratitude for life itself and for God's grace and mercy and for the fact that God truly does bring good things from bad. And in the same way, slavery in our country was a terrible thing. It was. But without it, I would not be here. Some of my ancestors, like Joseph, were sold into bondage by their kinsmen and forced to endure hardships. They were stripped of their freedom and their humanity. Because of that evil, I've been blessed to be born into the greatest country in the world, into a land of abundance and opportunity. Should I spit on that because of what happened in the past? Should I embrace grievance and victimhood instead of acknowledging the tremendous blessings that I have? We have to recognize that despite its scars, we are unbelievably blessed to live in a country that so many others are desperate to come to. Too many focus on these scars as evidence of victimhood and oppression, but our scars are what make our country great, not what make it broken. Our scars are what give us beauty. They are reminders, not of being victims, but of being victors. They are reminders of what we as a nation have endured and overcome. They are reminders of our strength and fortitude. They are reminders that good truly can come from bad. It is clear that we've been conditioned to see and think about race a certain way in this country. And because of that, it will be undeniably difficult to abandon that lens to view race as the arbitrary fabrication that it is. And it seems to me that the best way to do that is to intentionally abandon that collectivist thinking, embrace individualism, embrace gratitude, and instill these fundamental principles in our children, in the next generation. We must build the next generation to be better than us. That is how we will change the world. And this has been my mission. And I'll close here. To help initiate a true paradigm shift in America that sees our society abandon its vile infatuation with racial identity. I believe we must do everything we can to resist, reject, and dismantle the poison of critical race theory and all of its presuppositions. We must work to create a colorblind society and fulfill Dr. King's dream. The words black and white must be reduced to nothing more than physical descriptors, no different than blonde or brunette. We must reject the idea that these words should carry moral weight or that they should be used to assign guilt or victimhood, especially with children. We must, with every fiber of our beings, refuse to raise our children to be victims. Many believe that our society is too far gone, that the historical wounds are too deep, and that the cancer has too badly metastasized. I refuse to believe that. We've already overcome much in our young history as a nation, and I'm certain some colonists proclaimed that the Continental Army attempting to defeat the greatest military in the world to earn our independence from England was doomed to be futile. I'm sure countless people believed women could never gain the right to vote or be viewed as equals to men. And I'm aware of many who believed abolishing slavery itself was well beyond the realm of possibility, and that any efforts to do so should be abandoned. And there are many such examples of seemingly insurmountable obstacles in our nation's history. Obstacles that tore at the very fabric of our society that were nonetheless ultimately conquered. With God, all things are possible. Achieving colorblindness will not be done overnight, and perhaps it won't be achieved in my generation. But the age-old Greek proverb teaches us that a society grows great when old men plant trees under whose shade they know they may never sit. I want to help plant those trees, and I pray you will help plant them with me. Our country has already been through multiple paradigm shifts that have vastly altered our trajectory. I'm thoroughly convinced that we can create another one together. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So I have a question largely of how to respond to a particular narrative. So as part of what CRT wants to do, it's the destruction of society. And one area they focused on is the police in particular. So what do you think the best response to this sort of narrative of police brutality is in such a way that it doesn't, I don't know, make us sound like we're raging, angry conservatives, even if we might be?
Okay, so the police narrative. So one thing I didn't discuss this, but I've written a book on critical race theory, and it'll be out in February. It's called Raising Victims. So go pre-order it now. But one thing, I didn't talk about it today, but one thing I talk about in that book is the narrative around law enforcement and how it's completely distorted. So the way I would tell you to approach it is to approach it with facts. Approach it factually. Do your research. I'm telling you right now that the narrative that's pushed out by the media about police brutality and disproportionate impact on Black communities is false. It's a false narrative. It's not true. More unarmed white people are killed every year than unarmed Black people. White suspects are more, when you can control for violent crime rates, more white suspects are more likely to be shot by police. Like these statistics are not discussed. What the media does is they highlight certain cases. And there was a study done, and I forget which organization did the study, but they were kind of just, they were seeing what people's perception was of policing, and whether they thought that, well, was it 10 unarmed Black people killed per year? Or was it 100? Or was it 10,000? And a large percentage of people thought it was over 100. And I'm forgetting the percentage now. I'll have to go look at it again. But it was a large percentage of people thought it was over 100 unarmed Black people that were killed every year. And there was I think like 20% of far left people thought it was over 10,000. The actual number for the year of the study was 12. It was 12. So what I would do, what I normally look at, where I get some of my statistics, is the FBI Uniform Crime Report. It lists arrests by crime and by race. And you can look at it there. The Washington Post keeps a fatal force database, and they list whether a suspect was armed or what their race was, what their age was. You can break it down the database however you like. But that's what I would say, is be factual about it. Try to remove the emotion from it as much as possible. Now, in my interactions with people who have come to me about police brutality, it hasn't been a logical discussion. It hasn't been reasonable. And it's been very difficult. Like, even when I give them the facts and give them the statistics, they still lash out at me as an angry conservative. Yeah. So you're still going to have that. You're still going to have that little bit of irrationality to it. But that's what I would say. Do your homework, do your research. If you want to talk after, I can give you those statistics. Yeah.
Thank you for your very inspiring talk. How would you respond to, so Belmont University is right down the street in Nashville. They paid probably six figures to a fellow named Jamar Tisby. And Jamar Tisby is the he's the person that represents the Christian, quote unquote, Ibram Kendi. That's more or less, I think that's a fair estimation. I think that there's a lot of young, impressionable Christian young people that are being influenced by him, his statement about cancel culture and embracing cancel culture, and that we need to cancel people and things of that nature. I know he has a new thing where he's saying the crusade against anti-CRT, which I guess is a double negative, but then again, how would you respond to ostensible Christians like Jamar Tisby that are going into Christian institutions and essentially promoting CRT?
Yeah, it's tough. And one of the things that I've talked about is it becomes a little disenchanting to see that sort of thing cropping up in Christian circles. You have national church organizations that are pushing Kendi's anti-racism and critical race theory, and they're embracing Black Lives Matter. They had like murals of George Floyd, and I mean, it's just it's a little tough to deal with when you're seeing that happen. It's hard to say for sure. I mean, it would have to be the specific argument that we're talking about, and you have to hit it head on. I think, and this doesn't just apply to Christians. I think it applies to critical race theory and anti-racism in general. You have to be bold. You have to be rooted in the truth and not be afraid to speak it. And you mentioned cancel culture. That's a very real threat. And I get it. I understand that people are hesitant to push back against these things. For Tisby, it's easy because you're just like, you can put out those ideas and nobody's really going to challenge you very much because it's not countercultural. It goes in line with the culture, right? But to be countercultural, that's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you something, whether it's something small, like just being publicly denigrated, or something big, like losing your job and having your reputation destroyed, which has happened to people. So I understand people are hesitant to push back. Like I know people lost their jobs around the George Floyd thing because they questioned the narrative, just questioned whether it had anything to do with race. Not that it wasn't police brutality, but whether it had anything to do with race, and lost their jobs over that. So it's a very real thing. So I think you have to look inward, I think, and you have to think, how much am I willing to push back on this? And how much am I willing to go to battle with this thing? Because the devil's going to come after you. When you speak the truth, you try to shine light on the darkness, the devil's going to come after you. He's getting his fingers in the church, and he's using people like Tisby to do it. And people are becoming impressionable. And I was just talking to my wife about this a little bit ago. It's a shame because you have a lot of people who they're either scared to be against it or to be pushed back against it, or they feel like they want to be a part of it. They want to be accepted by the world, and they want to be accepted by the culture. But the progressivism and the far left, they've captured almost every institution in our society. So if you're not going to go along with it, you are by definition going to be countercultural. And they're going to call you all kinds of names. They're going to come after you. So you have to be rooted in the truth. You have to be rooted in God. You have to know who you are, and you have to be completely unafraid to speak the truth. It takes courage. It takes courage to do that. So that's not a very inspiring answer, but it's just what it's going to require. It's going to require viewing it as going to battle, because it really is a spiritual battle. When the George Floyd thing happened, I talked frequently about how it felt so much like psychological and spiritual warfare. People, even in the church, completely just lost their minds and started acting in ways I had never seen them act before. It was a clear spiritual and psychological attack. And that's what we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with in our society right now. So the same thing here with the previous question. You have to be willing to speak the truth, and you have to be willing to take the hits that are going to come from speaking it.
There's so much that makes discourse incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The philosophical concept of whiteness, the different definition of racism, everything, the rejection of Western logic on the whole. As a pastor and public figure especially, I would like to learn to have more constructive discourse, both with proponents of CRT on the macro and individual level, but also in training the people that I engage with to interact with it well. Do you have resources that you would recommend for training folks in that?
So, James Lindsay, are you familiar with him? No. So he has a organization called New Discourses, and I feel like I'm being a little repetitive here. I apologize, but one of the things, probably at the foundation of the way I approach these things, is research and knowing what you're talking about. And James Lindsay has done extensive research, probably more than you would like to know. But if you go look up New Discourses and look at some of his materials, he has a whole session on critical race theory where he breaks down the different components of it. So I think understanding its history, understanding what it's setting out to do, what its goals are, I think that is a key component for having, for even getting into any discourse. The other element I would say is we do have to approach it with some level of empathy. And that's just knowing what the other side is saying, what the other side believes. So I would recommend reading Critical Race Theory and Introduction. I pulled from that some. That's Richard Delgado and I forget his co-writer, but Richard Delgado was one of the original founders of critical race theory, and that book was supposed to be a primer for people who are not in the academic area, and it really explains what they believe in bullet point form. So understanding where the ideology is coming from, understanding what they believe and why they believe it, and then when you get into it, pinpointing the logical flaws in the arguments. But that's where I would start. As far as materials, I would start with James Lindsay because he does a great job. I don't know anybody else that does a better job than he does at opening up what critical race theory is with that more objective focus rather than an emotional one. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you.